I think we analytic philosophers have signally failed our colleagues in cognitive science. And we've done that by not sharing central lessons about the nature of concepts, concept use, and conceptual content that have been entrusted to our care and feeding for more than a century. I take it that analytic philosophy began with the birth of the new logic that Gottlob Frege introduced in his seminal 1879 Begriffsschrift. The idea, taken up and championed to begin with by Bertrand Russell, was that the fundamental insights and tools that Frege made available there and developed and deployed through the 1890s could be applied throughout philosophy to advance our understanding of understanding and of thought in general by advancing our understanding of concepts, including the particular concepts with which the philosophical tradition had wrestled since its inception. He made possible for the first time a mathematical characterization of meaning and conceptual content, and so ultimately of the structure of sapience itself. Henceforth, it was to be the business of the new movement of analytic philosophy to explore and amplify those ideas, to exploit and apply them wherever they could do the most good. Those ideas are the cultural birthright, the heritage, and the responsibility of analytic philosophers. But we've not done right by them, for we've failed to communicate some of the most basic of those ideas, failed to explain their significance, failed to make them available in forms usable by those working in allied disciplines who are also professionally concerned to understand the nature of thought, minds, and reason. Now, contemporary cognitive science is a house with many mansions. The provinces I mean particularly to be addressing are cognitive psychology, developmental psychology, animal psychology, especially primatology, and artificial intelligence. Cognitive psychology aims at reverse engineering the human mind, figuring out how we do what we do, what more basic abilities are recruited and deployed, and how, so as to result in the higher cognitive abilities that we actually display. Developmental psychology investigates the sequence of stages by which those abilities emerge from more primitive versions as individual humans mature. Animal psychology, as I'm construing it, is a sort of combination of cognitive psychology of non-human intelligences and a phylogenetic version of the ontogenetic human developmental psychology. And by contrast to all of those empirical inquiries into actual cognition, artificial intelligence swings free of questions about how any actual organisms do what they do, and asks instead what constellation of abilities of the sort we know how to implement in artifacts might in principle yield sapience. Each of these disciplines in its own way is concerned with the broadly empirical question of how the trick of cognition is or might be done. Philosophers are concerned with the normative question of what counts as doing it, with what understanding, particularly discursive, conceptual understanding, consists in, rather than how creatures with particular contingent constitution, history, and armamentarium of basic abilities come to exhibit it. I think Frege taught us three fundamental lessons about the structure of concepts, and hence about all possible abilities that deserve to count as concept-using abilities. The conclusion we should draw from his discoveries is that concept use is intrinsically stratified. It exhibits at least four basic layers, with each capacity to deploy concepts in a more sophisticated sense of concept, structurally presupposing the capacities to use concepts in all the more primitive senses. The three philosophical lessons that generate the structural hierarchy oblige us to distinguish between, first, concepts that only label and concepts that describe. Second, ingredient and freestanding conceptual contents, making explicit the distinction between the semantic contents of concepts and the pragmatic force of applying them, and between concepts expressible already by simple predicates and concepts expressible only by complex predicates. AI researchers and cognitive, developmental, and animal psychologists need to take account of these different grades of conceptual content that are made visible by these distinctions, both in order to be clear about the topic they're investigating. If they're going to tell us how the trick is done, they better be clear about exactly what trick it is, and because the empirical and in-principle possibilities are constrained by the way the abilities to deploy concepts in these various senses structurally presuppose the others that appear earlier in the sequence. This is a point that they have long appreciated on the side of basic syntactic complexity, but the at least equally important, and I would argue more conceptually fundamental, hierarchy of semantic complexity has been largely ignored. So, the first distinction, from labeling to describing. The early modern philosophical tradition was built around a classificatory theory of consciousness, and hence of concepts, in part as the result of what its scholastic predecessors had made of their central notion of Aristotelian forms. The paradigmatic cognitive act is understood as classifying, taking something particular as being of some general kind. Concepts are identified with those kinds. This conception was enshrined in the order of logical explanation, originating in Aristotle's prior Analytics, that was common to everyone thinking about concepts and consciousness in the period leading up to Kant. At its base is a doctrine of terms or concepts, particular and general. The next layer, erected on that base, is a doctrine of judgments, describing the kinds of classificatory relations that are possible among the terms. For instance, besides classifying Socrates as human, humans can be classified as mortal. Finally, in terms of those meta-classifications, grouping judgments into kinds, according to the sorts of terms they relate, a doctrine of consequences or syllogisms is propounded, classifying valid inferences into kinds, depending on which classes of classificatory judgments their premises and conclusions fall under. It's the master idea of classification that gives this traditional order of explanation its distinctive shape. That idea defines its base, the relation between its layers, and the theoretical aspiration that animates the whole line of thought, which is finding suitable ways of classifying terms and judgments, that is, classifiers and classifications, so as to be able in the end to classify inferences as good or bad solely in terms of the kinds of classifications they involve. The fundamental metaconceptual role that it plays in structuring philosophical thought about thought evidently made understanding the concept of classifying itself a particularly urgent philosophical task. Besides asking what differentiates various kinds of classification, we can ask what they have in common. What is it, in general, that one must do in order thereby to count as classifying something as being of some kind? In the most general sense, I think, one classifies something simply by responding to it differentially. Stimuli are grouped into kinds by the response kinds that they tend to elicit. In this sense, a chunk of iron classifies its environment into kinds by rusting in some of them and not others, increasing and decreasing its temperature, shattering, or remaining intact. But as is evident from this example, if classifying is just exercising a reliable, differential responsive disposition, it's a ubiquitous feature already of the inanimate world. And for that very reason, classifying in this generic sense is not an attractive candidate for identification with conceptual, cognitive, or conscious activity. It doesn't draw the right line between thinking and all sorts of thoughtless activities. Panpsychism is too high a price to pay for cognitive naturalism. But that need not mean that taking differential responsiveness as the genus of which conceptual classification is a species is a bad idea, though. And now I'm skipping a little bit. Classification, as the exercise of reliable differential responsive dispositions, however acquired, I said, is not yet itself a good candidate for a reading of conceptual classification, in the basic sense in which applying a concept to something is describing it. Why not? Suppose one were given a wand and told that the light on the